By the time the 9th wagon passed the ruined tollhouse, snow had climbed above the little girl's ankles. She stood beneath a broken porch roof with 2 newborn babies pressed under her coat, one against each side of her chest. Their blankets were stiff with ice. Their cries had grown so faint that sometimes she had to look down just to make sure they were still breathing. Every driver saw her. Every driver also saw the yellow quarantine rag nailed above the door, and every driver kept moving. One man crossed himself. Another shouted that he had children of his own and could not risk carrying fever home. A freighter threw a sack of oats into the snow, as if oats could warm a baby. No one climbed down. No one touched the girl. No one asked whether the warning cloth was new or had been hanging there since the spring epidemic. Then a gray gelding came out of the white curtain at a slow, stubborn walk. The rider saw the yellow rag. He saw the child. And instead of turning away, Silas Mercer pulled his horse sideways across the road. That decision lasted less than a second. Living with it would take the rest of his life. It was January of 1887, in the hard northern edge of Montana Territory, where winter did not simply cover the land, it erased it. Fence lines vanished. Creek beds became white scars. Familiar trails disappeared beneath drifts deep enough to swallow a horse to the belly. The small settlement of Cottonwood Crossing had already gone 6 days without a stage. Flour was being rationed. Kerosene cost twice what it had in December. Ranchers slept in their barns because cattle froze standing up when the wind shifted after midnight. Silas Mercer knew all of that. He also knew what yellow cloth meant. 7 months earlier, scarlet fever had passed through the lower valley. Families marked sick houses with strips of dyed muslin so travelers would keep their distance. Most of those warnings had been taken down by summer. The one above the toll house had not. Silas sat in the saddle, studying it while snow gathered on the shoulders of his buffalo coat. The little girl did not wave. She did not call for help. She only tightened her arms around the babies and watched him with the exhausted stillness of someone who had already learned that hope could be dangerous. His gelding, Ash, snorted and pawed at the road. Silas looked back. The nearest wagon was already a dark shape fading into the storm. He could keep riding. 11 miles remained between him and his ranch. He had lamp oil, coffee, salt, and medicine tied behind the saddle. A man alone in that weather did not volunteer for trouble. That was how sensible people survived. But one of the babies made a sound. Not a cry, a thin little catch of breath. Silas swung down. The girl stepped backward until her shoulders touched the toll house door. "Don't," she whispered. Silas stopped 6 feet away and removed his gloves so she could see his hands. "My name is Silas Mercer," she said nothing. "I own the horse place past Cinder Creek. Gray house, red barn. You may have seen it." Her eyes moved to the revolver on his belt, then back to his face. Silas unbuckled the gun belt slowly and laid it in the snow. "That better?" A small nod. He pointed toward the yellow cloth. "Who put that up?" The girl looked over her shoulder as if noticing it for the first time. It was already there. "Anybody sick inside?" "My brother is cold. My sister is cold. I'm cold." "Fever?" She shook her head. "Rash?" Another shake. Silas took 1 step closer. "How long have you been here?" Her lips trembled. "Since Mama went for help." "How long ago was that?" The girl looked toward the road. Snow had filled every track except the fresh prints left by Ash. 5 sleeps. Silas felt the answer settle in his chest like a stone. He knelt in the snow, still keeping distance between them. "What's your name?" "Clara Wynne." "How old are you, Clara?" 9. "And the babies?" "Eli and Rose." Mama said Eli came first, but Rose cried louder. Silas could barely hear her over the wind. "How old are they?" 6 days, maybe 7 now. The cold seemed to deepen around him. He had expected abandoned travelers, perhaps a sick family inside, perhaps a trap. He had not expected a 9-year-old girl holding 2 premature infants beneath a quarantine sign no one had bothered to question. He stood and pulled off his buffalo coat. Clara flinched. "I'm going to wrap all 3 of you," he said. "Then I'm going to look at those babies. I won't take them unless you say I can. You'll leave if they're sick." It was not a question. Silas met her eyes. "No." The word came out before he had time to measure it. Clara studied him for several seconds. Then she opened the front of her coat. Silas forgot the cold. The babies were wrapped in torn flour sacks under one thin wool blanket. Eli's face was gray around the mouth. Rose's tiny fists were tucked under her chin, but she did not move when the wind touched her skin. Silas had once held a newborn child. 7 years earlier, his son had fit along one forearm, warm and heavy with sleep. That memory struck so quickly he almost stepped away. Instead, he moved closer. "All right," he said, though nothing was all right. "We're going to do this carefully." He wrapped his coat around Clara and the twins. Then he lifted the girl, babies and all, as if she weighed no more than the saddle blanket on his horse. She stiffened in his arms. "I can walk, I know. I carried them this long. I know that too." He brought her beneath the deeper part of the porch and kicked open the tollhouse door. The single room smelled of old smoke, wet wood, and spoiled grain. A cracked stove sat in one corner. 2 benches had been pushed together beneath the window. On them lay a nest of burlap, torn petticoat cloth, and cedar branches. Clara had built a bed. Beside it sat an empty condensed milk tin, a broken cup, and 3 pieces of dried apple. Silas looked at the stove. "No wood? Used the last yesterday. Food?" Clara glanced at the dried apple. "That's for when Mama comes back." Silas turned away for a moment. He broke apart one of the benches, stuffed splinters into the stove, and struck a match with hands that had suddenly become clumsy. Smoke rolled into the room before the chimney caught. When the first flame climbed, Clara moved close enough to feel it but kept the babies hidden inside Silas's coat. He warmed water in a dented pot. He mixed a little sugar into it and fed the babies one careful drop at a time from the corner of a clean cloth. Rose swallowed. Eli did not. Silas rubbed the baby's back with one finger. "Come on, little man." "Nothing." He tried again, a tiny cough, then a swallow. Silas released a breath he had not known he was holding. Clara watched every movement. "Are you a doctor?" "No." "Then how do you know?" "I've seen calves born in February." Her eyes narrowed. "Babies aren't calves." "No, ma'am." For the first time, something almost like anger replaced the emptiness in her face. Silas welcomed it. Anger was warmer than surrender. He searched the room. In the ashes beside the stove, he found a strip of blue dress cloth burned along one edge. In the corner lay a woman's shoe with the heel split loose. On the wall, scratched into the wood with a nail, were 6 short lines. Clara's way of counting days. 5 had been crossed through. The 6th remained open. "Your mother left before the storm got this bad?" "It started after she went." "Where was she headed?" "Granite Camp. She said miners always need washing done. She was going to earn money for milk and come back before the lantern went out." Silas looked at the dead lamp on the shelf. "How far is Granite Camp?" She said 6 miles. It was closer to 9 in good weather. "Did she take a horse?" "We didn't have one." Silas closed his eyes briefly. A woman 6 days after delivering twins had walked into a Montana winter because her children needed milk. He wanted to tell Clara that no mother could have survived that road in the storm that followed. He wanted to tell himself the same thing. Instead, he said, "I'm taking you to my ranch. My neighbor Nora Bell knows more about babies than anybody within 50 miles. We'll come back and look for your mother as soon as the wind eases." Clara backed away. "No, Clara. Mama said wait here. If you stay—" "Eli may not live until morning." The words hurt her. He saw it. But they also reached her. She looked down at the baby beneath the coat. Eli's mouth opened in a silent attempt to cry. Clara's shoulders folded. "Will you leave a note?" "Yes, where she can see it." "I'll nail it to the door, and you won't split us up?" Silas paused. He could promise warmth. He could promise a search. He could promise to keep riding through snow until the horse failed under him. He could not promise what the county, the church, or the law might do when they learned 3 unclaimed children had been found. Clara read the hesitation. Her arms tightened. Silas crouched until they were eye to eye. "I will not leave you on this road," he said, "and I will not hand either baby to anyone tonight. That is the truth I can give you." She wanted more, he knew it, but after 5 days of broken promises, truth mattered more than comfort. Finally, Clara nodded. Silas wrote on the back of an old freight notice, "Hannawin, your children are alive." Silas Mercer took them to the gray house past Cinder Creek. "Follow the road marked with red cloth." He nailed the message beneath the yellow quarantine rag. Then he tore the old warning down. The rag came free with one hard pull. Snow had faded most of the dye. The date stamped in one corner was from the previous May. Every traveler who passed had been frightened by a warning 7 months out of date. Silas stared at it, then stuffed it beneath the saddle straps. Clara noticed. "Why are you taking it?" "Because people ought to remember what they were afraid of." He mounted, settled Clara in front of him, and tucked the twins inside his coat against his shirt. Their bodies were terrifyingly light. Ash turned toward Cinder Creek. Behind them, the tollhouse disappeared into the storm. Ahead, the trail had almost vanished. The ride should have taken 2 hours. It took 5. Silas kept one hand on the reins and the other spread across the babies beneath his coat. Every few minutes, Clara asked the same question. "Are they breathing?" "Every time," he answered. "Yes." Sometimes he had to press harder to be sure. At the first creek crossing, Ash broke through a crust of ice and nearly went to his knees. Clara screamed and wrapped both arms around the horse's neck. Silas pulled the gelding free, then sat still until Clara's breathing slowed. At the ridge above Cinder Creek, the wind hit them broadside. Silas turned Ash so his own body shielded the children. Snow found the gaps at his collar and melted down his back. He could not feel his left foot. Clara began to drift asleep. "Stay with me," he said. "I'm tired, I know. Tell me what color the barn is." "You said red." "What color is the house?" "Gray." "How many windows in front?" "You didn't say." "Then you'll have to stay awake and count them." She leaned back against him. "How many?" "4. You ruined it." "Then count the chimneys." "How many?" "1. You're bad at this." Silas almost laughed. It had been a long time since anyone had accused him of being bad at anything in that tone. By the time the ranch came into view, dusk had turned the snow blue. The gray house stood low against the valley, its single chimney breathing smoke. The red barn was nearly hidden behind drifts. A lantern swung beside the door, though Silas had not left one burning. Someone was waiting. Nora Bell stepped onto the porch before Ash reached the yard. She was 58, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and wrapped in a man's canvas coat. She had delivered half the valley and buried enough of the other half to recognize trouble before it spoke. "Silas Mercer," she shouted into the wind. "What have you brought me?" 3 children. Nora ran down the steps. "How long in the cold?" 5 days for the girl. "Babies are 6 or 7 days old." Nora's face changed. "Get them inside." The ranch house had not held that much movement in years. Nora cleared the kitchen table with one sweep of her arm. Silas heated water. Clara refused to release the twins until Nora promised twice that she would keep them within reach. When the coat opened, Nora said nothing for several seconds. That frightened Silas more than any exclamation would have. "Rose first," she said. "How do you know which is which?" Silas asked. Clara pointed. "Rose has the red thread around her ankle." Nora examined the baby, listened to her chest, and wrapped heated bricks in towels beside her. Then she lifted Eli. The boy did not protest. Nora rubbed his back. She tapped the soles of his feet. She held a spoon of warmed goat's milk against his lip. "Nothing, Silas. Bring the mirror from the hall." He did. Nora held it beneath Eli's nose. A faint cloud formed on the glass. "Still with us," she said, "but only just." Clara climbed onto a chair and leaned over the table. "Tell him to stay." Nora looked at her. "You tell him." Clara bent until her mouth was beside her brother's ear. "Mama's coming," she whispered. "You can't leave before she gets here." Eli made a thin, angry sound. Nora smiled without looking up. "Good. Anger is useful." For the next 3 hours, they fed the twins by drops. They changed the cold cloth around them whenever it cooled. They moved the babies closer to the stove, then farther away when their skin grew too warm. Nora showed Silas how to hold Eli upright against his chest so the boy could breathe without fighting the blanket. Clara sat on the floor beside his boots. She did not speak. She did not sleep. Near midnight, Rose began crying. The sound was weak but steady. Clara covered her face with both hands. Silas thought she was frightened. Then he realized she was laughing. It came out mixed with sobs, a broken little sound that filled the kitchen more completely than any song. Rose cried louder. Eli finally swallowed half a spoonful of milk. Nora leaned against the table. "They have a chance." Clara looked at Silas. "You said your house had 4 windows. It does. I counted 5. The kitchen window faces the side. You still lied." "It appears I did." "Will Mama know which house?" Silas looked toward the dark glass. "I left her a note. What if snow covers it?" "I'll go back at first light." Nora turned sharply. "You will not. I gave my word. You can barely stand. I gave my word." Nora studied him, then lowered her voice. "Words do not keep a man warm in a whiteout. No, but sometimes they keep a child alive." Clara heard him. Her eyes closed for the first time that night. She slept sitting upright against the wall, one hand resting on the basket where the twins lay. Silas carried her to the small room off the kitchen. It had once been his office. For years it had held ledgers, tack catalogs, and boxes he never opened. He laid Clara on the narrow bed and pulled a quilt to her chin. She caught his sleeve before he could leave. "Don't take them anywhere." "I won't. Promise." Silas looked toward the kitchen where the twins slept under Nora's watch. "I promise they will be in this house when you wake." Clara released him. That was the first promise she accepted from him. At dawn, Silas saddled Ash. The storm had weakened, but the cold had sharpened. The thermometer beside the barn door read 24 below zero. A horse's breath froze white along its whiskers. Every board in the corral popped like a rifle shot. Nora came out carrying coffee. "You find no tracks. You turn back. I'll turn back when I know there's nothing to follow. You think grief makes you harder than weather?" Silas tightened the cinch. "No." Nora handed him the cup. "I think grief makes you stupid." He drank. She softened. "Bring back the mother if you can. Bring back yourself if you cannot." The trail to the toll house had nearly closed. Silas marked trees with red cloth as he rode, just as he had written on the note. At the station, the message still hung beneath the doorframe. No new footprints crossed the yard. Inside, the little fire had gone out. Clara's cedar bed remained against the wall. Silas found a second shoe beneath the bench, then a sewing kit, 2 baby caps, and a Bible with the name Hannah Wynne written in careful letters. Tucked inside the Bible was a freight receipt. H. Wynne, 1 trunk. Passage paid to Cottonwood Crossing. The receipt was dated 12 days earlier. Someone had dropped Hannah and the children at the toll house, though no stage was supposed to stop there in winter. On the back, in different handwriting, were 4 words: "Balance due left to collect." Silas felt anger rise. The freight company had unloaded a woman, a 9-year-old girl, and newborn twins at an abandoned station because Hannah lacked the final $2 of fare. He folded the receipt and placed it inside his coat. Outside, he searched along the road toward Granite Camp. For half a mile, nothing remained but wind-carved snow. Then Ash stopped. A strip of blue cloth fluttered from a thorn bush beside the trail. It matched the burned fabric near the toll house stove. Silas dismounted. Below the bush, almost hidden in the drift, a line of shallow depressions angled away from the road toward Devil's Cut. Not footprints exactly. The storm had erased too much, but something had passed there on foot. Silas followed. Devil's Cut was a narrow ravine where freighters shortened the route to Granite Camp. In summer, the descent saved an hour. In winter, it trapped wind and buried wagons. At the bottom, Silas found a broken harness buckle. Farther on, a black hat lay frozen into the snow. Then he saw the wagon. It had overturned against the ravine wall, one wheel splintered, the bed half buried. Silas slid down the bank. No body lay beneath it, no horse remained in the traces. In the snow beside the driver's seat, someone had dug a shallow hollow and lined it with sagebrush. Inside the hollow were blood-stained bandages made from blue dress cloth. Hannah had reached the cut. She had found someone injured, or someone had found her. Silas searched until the light began to fail. He found 2 sets of old tracks leading north from the wreck, then lost them beneath a drift. One set belonged to a horse. The other looked as if someone had been dragged. He wanted to continue. He also heard Nora's warning. 3 children waited in his house. One of them had already survived 5 days because she believed an adult would return. Silas turned Ash toward home. It felt like betrayal. When he reached the ranch after dark, Clara was standing in the doorway wearing one of his wool shirts over her dress. She looked past him. "Where is she?" Silas dismounted slowly. "I found a wrecked freight wagon near Devil's Cut." Clara's face brightened for one impossible second. Was Mama there? No. The light vanished, but she had been there. "I found cloth from her dress. I found signs that someone was hurt and signs that 2 people left the wreck. Then she's alive." Silas could not say yes. He could not say no. Clara stepped into the snow barefoot. "She's alive." Silas took off his scarf and wrapped it around her. "We're going to keep looking. You promised. I remember." Inside, Eli and Rose slept in a wooden laundry basket beside the stove. Eli's color had improved. Rose cried whenever Nora moved more than 3 feet away. The sound was powerful enough to annoy everyone in the room. It was the most beautiful annoyance Silas had ever heard. For 2 days, the storm closed the valley again. Silas could not search. Clara measured time by the window. She stood there every morning after feeding the twins, staring toward the ridge until her breath clouded the glass. She spoke little about herself. What Silas learned came in pieces. Hannah had been widowed the previous autumn when a logging accident killed Clara's father. The mill owner paid for the coffin, then charged the cost against wages the family never received. Hannah sold their cabin, bought stage fare west, and planned to join a cousin near Helena. The cousin had moved before they arrived. The twins came early in a freight wagon. The driver left them at the toll house after Hannah could not pay the final $2. "His name was Mr. Kells," Clara said. "How do you know?" "It was painted on his box." Silas wrote it down. Clara watched. "What will you do? Find him." "Then what?" Silas had several answers, none suitable for a 9-year-old. "Ask him why." Clara looked toward the twins. People always have a why when they leave. Silas heard the deeper meaning. He set down the pencil. Sometimes the why is fear. Sometimes it is greed. Sometimes it is that a person is smaller inside than they look from the outside. What's Mama's why? Your mother walked into a blizzard 6 days after giving birth because you needed help. That isn't leaving? Silas shook his head. No, that's trying to come back. Clara held his gaze. She wanted to believe him. Belief, Silas understood, was a door that opened more slowly after it had been forced. On the third day, Sheriff Caleb Dorsey arrived with Reverend Josiah Pike from Cottonwood Crossing. They came in a sleigh pulled by 2 shaggy mules. Behind them sat Mrs. Tolland, who ran the church boarding home. Clara saw the sleigh from the window and immediately carried the babies into the pantry. Silas met the visitors on the porch. Dorsey removed his hat. Heard what you found. News travels through closed roads now? Nora sent her nephew for medicine. He told the whole town before he reached the apothecary. Reverend Pike stamped snow from his boots. He was not an unkind man. That made what followed harder. Mr. Mercer, he said, the children have no confirmed guardian. Their mother is missing. Yes, and until she is found, the county has obligations. They are warm, they are fed. Temporary shelter is not legal custody. Silas looked at Mrs. Tolland. She avoided his eyes. What are you proposing? The twins should go to the boarding home as soon as the pass opens, Pike said. Clara can remain there until a family is found. Together, Mrs. Tolland finally spoke. We have 1 wet nurse and 6 infants already. We cannot manage both babies. Silas's voice went quiet. So not together. We may find a farm family for the boy, Pike said. Girls are easier to place in town. Place. It is the word the law uses. Silas stepped between them and the door. Then the law can use it somewhere else. Dorsey's expression hardened. Careful. Those children nearly froze beneath a warning rag. The whole county was too frightened to question. Do not come to my house and tell me fear has suddenly become duty. Pike flushed. Dorsey held up one hand. No one's taking them today. The road is closed. But the judge will expect an account and someone must petition for guardianship. Silas laughed once, without humor. You think Judge Whitcomb will give 3 children to a widowed horse rancher who lives 11 miles from town? I think he will ask what plan you have. Silas glanced toward the house. He had no plan. He had a kitchen crowded with bottles. He had a 9-year-old wearing his shirts. He had 2 infants sleeping in a laundry basket. He had a locked room upstairs he had not opened in 7 years. Pike saw the uncertainty. Mr. Mercer, wanting to help is honorable. Raising children is another matter. Clara stood behind the door. No one knew she was listening. How long? Silas asked. Dorsey answered. The county wagon is expected in 10 days, weather allowing. 10 days. Until then, they stay here if Nora continues checking on them. Silas nodded. Mrs. Tolland set a packet of forms on the porch rail. Papers for temporary care. Silas did not touch them. The visitors left after half an hour. When the sleigh disappeared, Silas found Clara in the pantry sitting between flour barrels with one arm around the basket. They're going to separate us. Not today. They said 10 days. I heard them. You promised. I promised I would not hand them to anyone that night. Clara's face emptied in the same way it had beneath the tollhouse porch. Silas hated himself for speaking the truth too narrowly. Clara, that is how grown people promise. They leave room inside the words. The sentence struck harder than an accusation shouted in anger. She carried the twins past him and closed the kitchen door. That night, Silas stood at the bottom of the stairs. At the top was a narrow hallway and one locked door. He kept the key in a tin box beneath his bed. The room behind that door had belonged to his son. Though Caleb Mercer had lived only 19 days, Silas had built the cradle before the birth. He had planed the pine until every rail felt smooth beneath his fingers. Margaret had sewn blue stars onto a white quilt. They had argued about where the cradle should stand so morning light would not reach the baby's eyes. Then fever came, first Caleb, then Margaret. By the end of the week, Silas had closed the door and turned the key. For 7 years, dust had gathered around everything they had chosen together. Now 2 babies slept in a laundry basket because Silas could not walk up 13 steps. He climbed. The key resisted. When the door opened, cold air met him. The curtains were still tied back with blue ribbon. The tiny quilt lay folded across the cradle. A wooden horse sat on the windowsill with one wheel missing. Silas stood in the doorway until his knees weakened. Grief had not faded in the room. It had simply gone still. He crossed to the cradle and placed one hand on the rail. I don't know what I'm doing, he said to the darkness. No answer came. But downstairs Rose began to cry. Silas lifted the cradle. It was heavier than he remembered. He carried it down. Clara sat beside the stove. When she saw the blue star quilt, her eyes moved to his face. Whose was it? My son's. Where is he? Silas set the cradle beside her. He died. Clara looked at the empty quilt. Did his mama die too? Yes, did you? Silas frowned. She touched her own chest. Inside, he had no defense against the question. Some days, Clara considered that. Then she lifted Rose into the cradle. Eli went beside her. The two babies turned toward each other until their faces almost touched. Clara pulled the quilt to their chins. Maybe this room was waiting for them. It wasn't the room that was locked, Silas said. She looked up. He did not explain. Some truths were clearer without explanation. The next morning, Silas signed the temporary care papers. He also signed a petition for guardianship. Nora witnessed it. You know this may not be enough, she said. I know. You know the judge may say a man alone cannot raise 3 children. I know. You know keeping them could cost more than the ranch earns in a bad year. Silas dipped the pen again. I know. Nora leaned over the table. Do you know why you're doing it? Silas looked toward Clara, who was feeding Eli beside the stove. No, he said. But for the first time in 7 years, not knowing does not feel empty. The search for Hannah continued. Silas rode to Devil's Cut, twice more. Sheriff Dorsey sent men toward Granite Camp. The mine foreman checked bunkhouses and wash sheds. No one had employed a woman named Hannah Wynne. They found the injured freighter's wagon listed in a company ledger, but not the freighter himself. His name was Abel Ford. He had been carrying lamp oil, canned peaches, and patent medicine from Cottonwood Crossing to Granite Camp when the storm struck. The company assumed he had died. Clara refused to believe Hannah had died with him. 2 people left the wreck, she reminded Silas. Yes. Then 2 people went somewhere. Yes. People don't disappear. Silas wanted to tell her that in winter they did. Instead, he said, then we keep asking. Days passed. The twins strengthened. Eli learned to complain about cold milk. Rose discovered that a cry delivered at full force could summon 3 adults from different rooms. Clara began helping in the barn, not because anyone asked her, but because she could not bear to sit by the window all day. She was good with frightened animals. A bay mare named June had refused every hired hand since being caught in an early freeze. Clara entered the stall without a rope and sat in the straw talking about nothing. After an hour, the mare lowered her head into Clara's lap. Silas watched from the doorway. How did you do that? I didn't chase her, that's all. Most things run when they think you want to own them. Silas suspected she was not talking about the mare. He began teaching her to brush the horses, then to clean hooves, then to sit a saddle on Ash while he held the reins. The first time Ash took 3 steps, Clara laughed so suddenly that the horse stopped and looked back at her. Silas laughed too. The sound startled him. It had been absent so long from the house that he barely recognized it as his own. But the 10-day deadline moved closer. On the 8th day, a county notice arrived. The weather had improved enough for the boarding home wagon to leave town in 2 mornings. Judge Whitcomb would hear Silas's petition when court reopened in the spring. Until then, the children would remain under county supervision. The wording was polite, the result was not. Silas read the notice twice. Nora stood across the kitchen. What will you do? Ride to town. The judge is in Helena. Then I'll ride to Helena. The pass is closed. Then I'll wait at his door until it opens. And who stays here? Silas looked at Clara. She had gone pale. Nobody is taking you tomorrow, he said. The paper says 2 mornings. I can read. So can I. He folded the notice. We will find a way. Clara backed toward the hall. You said that before. Clara. She turned and ran upstairs. That evening she did not come to supper. Silas left a plate outside her door. At midnight it remained untouched. The house grew quiet. Too quiet. Silas woke before dawn with the feeling that something had changed. The cradle beside the stove was empty. Clara's coat was gone. So was the laundry basket. The back door stood open, snow blowing across the floor. For 1 second, Silas could not move. Then every fear he had carried for 7 years broke loose at once. He shouted Clara's name. No answer. Nora came from the spare room. What happened? They're gone. Silas ran to the barn. Ash was still in his stall. So were the other horses. Small tracks crossed the yard toward the hay meadow. Clara had left on foot, carrying both infants in the basket. The temperature had fallen again during the night, 12 below, wind coming from the north. She'll head for the tollhouse, Nora said. She can't make 11 miles. She doesn't know that. Silas threw a saddle on Ash. Nora grabbed the reins. Think. A child carrying 2 babies won't take the road if she fears the county wagon. She'll hide. Silas looked at the tracks. They did not reach the road. They turned toward the north barn. He ran. The old lambing shed stood beyond the main corral, half buried along the lee side of a hill. Silas had not used it in years. The door was blocked by snow. He dug with both hands. Inside, darkness swallowed the lantern light. "Clara?" A sound came from the far stall. Not a voice. A baby's cry cut short. Silas found Clara beneath a pile of horse blankets. The basket sat against her chest. Snow had melted in her hair. Her fingers were bare because she had wrapped her mittens around the twins' feet. Rose was crying. Eli was silent. Silas tore open the blankets. The boy's lips were blue. "No." He lifted Eli. The baby hung limp in his hands. "Clara, how long? I don't know. How long? I thought the shed would be warm. I thought if nobody saw us, they couldn't take them." Silas pressed Eli against his chest. No movement. He rubbed the boy's back. Nothing. He covered the baby's mouth and nose with his own and gave one tiny breath, then another. "Come on!" Rose cried beside him. Clara began to pray, but the words broke apart. Silas gave another breath. A cough shuddered through Eli's body. Then silence. Again Silas whispered. He breathed. Eli jerked and released a thin wail. Silas bowed over him. The sound was weak. It was enough. He wrapped both babies beneath his coat and lifted Clara by the arm. "We are going back." She stumbled after him. At the house, Nora took the twins. Silas stood by the stove, shaking so violently he could not remove his coat. Clara waited near the door. When Nora said Eli was breathing steadily, Silas turned. His fear became anger before he could stop it. "What were you thinking?" Clara flinched. "You could have killed them. You could have died. You do not carry newborns into 12 below weather and hide in an empty shed." "They were going to take them. I said I would find a way. Grown people say that when they don't have one." Silas stopped. Clara's face crumpled. "I promised Mama," she sobbed. "I promised I would keep us together. I already lost her. I can't lose them too." Silas's anger vanished. He crossed the room and knelt. "I was afraid," he said. Clara looked at him through tears. "I was afraid the judge would tell me I was not enough. Afraid the county would take you. Afraid I would love all 3 of you and lose you the way I lost Margaret and Caleb." Clara pressed both fists against her eyes. Silas continued, "But being afraid does not excuse leaving you alone with that fear." He placed the county notice on the stove. The paper curled. Flame ran along one edge. Nora stared at him. "That is an official document. Then they can send another." The notice blackened and fell into the fire. Silas looked at Clara. "I cannot promise what a judge will do. I can promise what I will do. I will stand between you and every person who tries to separate you. I will ride to every court in the territory. I will sell every horse on this land if I have to. I will not disappear because the road gets hard." Clara lowered her hands. "You won't leave room inside the words?" "No. Say it again." Silas took both of her cold hands in his. "I will not let them separate this family." The word hung between them, family. No one corrected it. That afternoon a rider appeared on the south ridge. At first, Silas thought the county had come early. Then he saw the horse stumbling. The rider leaned forward over the saddle horn, one arm tied against his chest. Silas ran outside. The man nearly fell before Ash's corral. He was in his late 30s, bearded, hollow-eyed, and missing 2 fingers from his left glove. A splint held his right arm. "Mercer Place?" he asked. "Yes." The man looked past Silas toward the house. Children named Clara, Eli, and Rose. Silas's hand closed around the gate. "Who are you?" "Abel Ford, the missing freighter." Clara came onto the porch. Abel removed his hat. She saw the blue cloth tied around his broken arm, Mama's dress. Abel's face collapsed. "Yes, miss." Clara walked down the steps very slowly. "Where is she?" Abel could not answer at first. He reached inside his coat and removed a small oilskin packet. "I owe you the truth," he said. Inside the house, Nora set the packet on the kitchen table. Abel sat near the stove, shivering despite the heat. He drank broth before he spoke. His freight wagon had overturned in Devil's Cut when the wheels struck buried rock. The team bolted. The wagon rolled. His arm broke under the seat, and a crate crushed his leg. He had been there almost a day when Hannah found him. "She should have kept walking," Abel said. "She was barely standing herself. She told me she had newborn babies waiting at the old toll house. I told her to go. She wouldn't." Hannah dug him free with a broken shovel blade. She tore strips from her dress to bind his leg and arm. She found one of the team horses caught in brush farther down the ravine. The horse was injured but able to walk. Hannah loaded Abel across the saddle. Then she walked beside him through the storm. She kept falling, Abel said. Every time she fell, she got up because she said somebody had to reach the mining camp and send help back to you. Clara held the oilskin packet against her chest. Did she reach it? Not Granite Camp. We reached a line shack used by telegraph crews about 4 miles north. There was food, a stove, a handcar rail line to the main road. Abel's voice broke. She saved my life. What happened to her? She had been bleeding since the twins were born. She hid it. By the time we reached the shack, the fever had taken hold. I could not move my arm. I could not walk. She still made the fire. Clara's chin trembled. Abel continued because stopping would have been crueler. They found us 3 days later. Telegraph men. They carried us to Granite Camp. The doctor did what he could. Was she alone? No. Did she ask for us? Every hour. Clara closed her eyes. Did she think we believed she left? Abel shook his head. That was the one thing she feared most. He pushed the oilskin packet toward her. She made me promise. Inside was a silver thimble, a wedding ring wrapped in cloth, and 3 folded pages. The paper had been torn from a telegraph ledger. The writing on the first page was Hannah's, shaky and uneven. The rest had been written by someone else while she dictated. Clara unfolded the letter. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Silas asked, "Would you like me to read it?" She handed him the pages. He began. "My dearest Clara, if these words reach you before I do, I need you to know the road did not make me forget you. I left because Eli was too weak to cry and Rose needed milk I could not give her. I believed I could reach Granite Camp and return before dark. I was wrong about the storm, but I was never wrong to trust your courage. You have carried more than any child should carry. You are not responsible for saving everyone by yourself." Please hear that again. You are not responsible for saving everyone by yourself. Clara covered her mouth. Silas kept reading. "Mr. Ford says a rancher named Mercer lives near Cinder Creek. I do not know this man. I do not know whether he will ever meet you. But the telegraph men say he is fair, and that his house has stood through every winter for 15 years. If he is the one who finds you, judge him by what he does after the danger is past. Many people stop for a moment, the good ones stay." Silas's voice failed. Nora took the letter and continued. "Tell Eli that he fought before he had words. Tell Rose that her voice carried farther than the storm. And Clara, my brave girl, let someone hold the weight with you. Love is not another burden you must carry alone. I did not abandon you. I was walking home until my body could walk no farther. Your loving mother, Hannah." Clara sat perfectly still. Then she slid from the chair and folded against Silas. The first cry came from somewhere deep inside her, older than 9 years, rougher than any sound a child should know. Silas held her. He did not tell her not to cry. He did not say Hannah was in a better place. He did not promise the pain would pass. He simply stayed. Across the room, Eli began fussing in the cradle. Rose answered. Clara lifted her head. "She knew your name, only from the telegraph men. She said to judge you by what you did after the danger passed." Silas looked at the babies. The danger had not passed. It had changed shape. Abel Ford spent the night at the ranch. By morning his statement had been written and signed. It proved Hannah Wynne had died in Granite Camp. It also named Clara as the person Hannah trusted to keep the twins together until a proper home could be found. The law did not recognize the wishes of a dying mother as a completed guardianship, but Judge Whitcomb would have to hear them. Sheriff Dorsey arrived before noon with the county sleigh. He stepped into the kitchen, saw Abel, read the statement, and removed his hat. Then he looked at Silas. "Are you still petitioning?" "Yes. The county expects the children today. They are not going," Dorsey sighed. "Do not make me choose between friendship and office. I'm asking you to do your office. My office follows the law, then follow all of it. The statute allows emergency placement when travel risks a child's life. Eli nearly died this morning, Nora will testify." Nora folded her arms. "Gladly." Dorsey looked at the child. Clara stood beside the cradle wearing Silas's wool shirt, Hannah's silver thimble on a string around her neck. Abel placed his signed statement on the table. The sheriff read it again. Reverend Pike waited in the sleigh outside. Finally, Dorsey said, "I can delay removal for 30 days on medical grounds. Do it. It may cost me." Silas looked toward the window, where the old yellow quarantine rag hung from a nail. Stopping cost less than riding past would have. Dorsey signed the delay. The county sleigh left empty. 30 days later, the pass opened enough for travel. Judge Whitcomb returned to Cottonwood Crossing for a winter docket held in the church hall because the courthouse roof had collapsed under snow. Half the valley attended. Some came out of concern. Some came because frontier people would cross 10 miles of ice to witness a private sorrow become public business. Silas stood before the judge in a clean black coat that no longer fit across his shoulders. Clara sat behind him with Nora. Eli and Rose slept in separate baskets at their feet. Reverend Pike presented the county's position. He spoke honestly. Silas was unmarried. His ranch was isolated. Infant care required constant attention. Clara had no schooling arrangement. The children had no blood relation to him. 3 homes had expressed interest in taking one child each. One child each. The words moved through the hall like a cold draft. Judge Whitcomb adjusted his spectacles.
Mr. Mercer, why should this court place all 3 children with you?
Silas had rehearsed an answer for a week. He forgot every word. He looked at Clara. She watched him without blinking. He looked at Eli, whose fist had escaped the blanket. He looked at Rose, who was beginning to wake. Then he saw the yellow quarantine rag folded on the evidence table beside Hannah's letter. Silas faced the judge. Because everyone keeps asking whether I can provide enough for them. The judge waited. I own 42 horses, 200 acres of winter grass, a house with 5 windows in front if you count the kitchen, and more debt than I would like to discuss in church. A few people laughed. Silas did not. I can tell you what I earn in a good year. I can tell you the price of oats, the number of milk goats Nora says we need, and what it costs to hire a teacher twice a week. He took a breath. But that is not the first question. What is? The judge asked. Whether separating them solves anything except the county's inconvenience. The hall went still. Clara kept 2 babies alive for 5 days under a false warning sign. Her mother died trying to return. Eli nearly froze a second time because Clara believed the law would take her family unless she hid it. These children do not need 3 placements. They need one place where no one disappears. Judge Whitcomb leaned back. And you believe you can be that place? Silas glanced at the empty chair beside him. For years, every room in his house had been arranged around absence. I believe a house can be repaired, he said. A roof, a fence, a cradle. A man can learn what he does not know. But if this court splits them now, no amount of money will repair what they learned from it. The judge turned to Clara. Miss Wynne, would you come forward? Clara stood. Silas felt her small hand find his. Judge Whitcomb lowered his voice. Do you understand that Mr. Mercer is asking to become responsible for you and the twins? Yes, sir. Do you wish to remain at his ranch? Clara looked at Silas. Will the court make him stay? A murmur moved through the room. Judge Whitcomb looked at Silas. No court can make a person stay in the way you mean. Clara's fingers tightened. Silas knelt beside her. The court does not have to make me. She searched his face. No room inside the words? No room. Clara turned back to the judge. Then yes. Judge Whitcomb removed his spectacles. The law required inspections, sureties, and a waiting period. The adoption could not be completed that day. But the emergency guardianship could. He signed the order placing all 3 children with Silas Mercer until the spring term. No one in the hall applauded. The moment was too tender for noise. Nora cried openly. Sheriff Dorsey pretended to study the stove. Reverend Pike carried Eli's basket to the sleigh. On the ride home, Clara sat beside Silas. Does temporary mean they can change their minds? It means we have work to do. What kind? Build another bedroom, hire a teacher, buy 2 more goats. 3, why 3? Rose eats like a wolf. Silas looked at the sleeping baby. 3 goats. Clara leaned against his arm. For the first time since he found her, she fell asleep before reaching the ranch. Spring came late. When the snow finally withdrew from the valley, it revealed broken fences, dead grass, and the wreckage of a winter people would talk about for decades. It also revealed red cloth markers tied to trees along the road from the old toll house to the Mercer ranch. Silas had left them in place. Travelers used the markers when fog covered the low ground. Clara planted wildflower seeds beside each one. At the ranch, the locked room upstairs became a nursery. The Blue Star quilt stayed in the cradle until the twins outgrew it. Silas repaired the wooden horse and placed it between their beds. He built Clara a desk beneath the east window, where she could see the barn and the road at the same time. A teacher named Miss Avery came every Tuesday and Friday. Clara hated arithmetic and loved reading. She could recite every line of Hannah's letter, but kept it folded in oilskins so the paper would not wear thin. Abel Ford recovered enough to drive freight again. He never worked for Kells Transport. The company owner, Mr. Kells, was fined for abandoning passengers at an unauthorized stop. The fine was only $25. Silas considered that insultingly small. Abel considered it more than anyone expected. The $2 balance Hannah had lacked became known across Cottonwood Crossing. For years afterward, a jar sat beside the ticket window at the new stage office. Travelers in need. No family was left on the road over unpaid fare again. By May, the court investigator visited the ranch. He found clean beds, stocked shelves, 2 healthy infants, 1 suspicious goat in the kitchen, and a 9-year-old girl riding a gray gelding through the lower pasture while Silas shouted instructions she mostly ignored. By June, Judge Whitcomb approved permanent guardianship. The formal adoption hearing came in September. Silas wore the same black coat. Clara wore a blue dress Nora had sewn from new fabric. Eli pulled off 1 shoe before the judge entered. Rose attempted to eat the corner of the petition. When the papers were placed before Silas, his hand trembled. Judge Whitcomb noticed. "Cold in here, Mr. Mercer?" "No, sir," Silas signed. Clara Wynne became Clara Mercer. Eli and Rose kept Wynne as their middle name so Hannah's name would travel with them. After the judge sealed the order, Clara did not run across the room or throw her arms around Silas. She stood beside him very seriously. "Is it done? It is done. All the way? All the way. No temporary? No temporary." She nodded. Then she placed Hannah's silver thimble in his palm. "What is this for?" "Mama said to let someone hold the weight with me." Silas closed his fingers around the thimble. Clara wrapped both arms around his waist. He held her with one hand and the tiny piece of silver with the other. Years passed. The ranch changed in ways no ledger could measure. Eli grew tall and careful, the kind of boy who repaired a hinge before anyone noticed it sagging. Rose grew fearless and loud. She sang while milking goats, argued with traveling salesmen, and once rode 20 miles to bring a doctor to a ranch hand with a crushed leg. Clara became the best horsewoman in the county. At 16, she could settle a frightened colt faster than men twice her age. At 19, she began teaching children from isolated ranches in the front room of the Mercer house. At 23, she turned the abandoned toll house into something the territory had never had before. A winter refuge. Silas repaired the roof. Abel Ford rebuilt the stove. Sheriff Dorsey donated 2 iron bunks. Reverend Pike organized blankets without being asked. Nora stocked dried milk, bandages, matches, and coffee. Clara hung the old yellow quarantine rag inside a glass frame. Beneath it, she placed a new sign, "Stop before you decide." Travelers knew what it meant. A warning might be true. A stranger might be dangerous. A storm might make caution necessary. But fear did not relieve a person of the duty to look closely. Over the next 20 years, the refuge sheltered stranded miners, a woman in labor, 2 runaway boys, a salesman with a broken leg, and more than 40 families caught between Cottonwood Crossing and Cinder Creek. No one was charged. No one was asked whether they could repay the wood or food. A red cloth marker on the porch told travelers that help waited inside. Silas grew older, his hair silvered, his left knee stiffened. He stopped breaking horses and began teaching Eli how to do it without breaking their spirit. Some winter evenings he sat beside the fire while Rose read aloud and Clara graded lessons at the table. The house had 5 front windows after all. Eli added one to the nursery when he was 17. On the wall beside the fireplace hung Hannah's letter, protected behind glass. Beneath it rested the silver thimble. Visitors often asked Silas why he had stopped that day when 9 others had passed. He gave different answers over the years. Sometimes he said Ash refused to keep walking. Sometimes he said he heard Eli breathe. Sometimes he said the yellow rag looked too old, but Clara knew the answer he rarely spoke. Silas had recognized the look in her eyes, not hunger, not cold, the look of someone waiting for a person who was never coming back. He knew that road because part of him had been standing on it for 7 years. One evening, long after Eli and Rose were grown, Clara found him at the refuge replacing a warped porch board. Snow had begun to fall. She held the board steady while he drove the nails. "Do you ever think about riding past?" she asked. Silas set down the hammer. "Every winter, what do you think would have happened?" "I know what would have happened." Clara looked toward the road. The first white layer covered the ground where she had once stood with 2 babies beneath her coat. Silas touched the red help cloth beside the door. "I thought I stopped to save 3 children," he said. Clara smiled. "You did," he shook his head. "No, I stopped because some part of me was still waiting here too." Snow settled across the roof of the refuge, but light burned warm behind every window. On the porch, the old cowboy and the little girl he had found stood side by side, listening to the quiet road. That winter, Silas Mercer did not rescue a family. He stopped long enough to become part of one.